A street thug thought he could intimidate anyone, even a marching royal guard. But the moment he threw a punch, reality hit him back twice as hard. What happened next left the crowd in stunned silence. Here's how it all unfolded. Before we continue, let us know in the comments below where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow at the same time we'll bring you another incredible story showcasing the bravery and discipline of the Royal Guard. You won't want to miss it. The metallic clang of a trash can hitting the pavement echoed through the early morning air outside Buckingham Palace. Mike Conway's steel-toed boots crunched over the scattered garbage as he stalked past the overturned bin, not bothering to look back at the mess he'd created. At 27, he carried himself with the menacing confidence of someone who'd spent more time in police stations than classrooms. "Oi, watch where you're going!" he snarled at an elderly tourist who'd barely brushed his leather jacket. The woman hurried away, clutching her handbag closer. Mike's lips curled into a familiar sneer, the same expression he'd worn during his last court appearance for assault. 3 convictions hadn't taught him respect. They'd only made him better at choosing his targets. The morning sun hadn't yet reached its full strength, but tourists were already gathering along the palace fence. Mike moved through them like a shark through shallow water, his muscled frame tense with barely contained aggression. Local police knew him well, too well. He'd earned his reputation through broken noses and shattered windows, through nights that ended with blood on his knuckles and mornings that began with court summons. "Bunch of sheep," he muttered, shouldering past a young family trying to take photos. His voice carried the rough edge of cheap cigarettes and cheaper whiskey. The father pulled his children back instinctively, recognizing the threat in Mike's bearing. 8 years of street fights had taught Mike how to carry himself, how to make others feel his presence before he even spoke. A group of Japanese tourists parted before him, their excited chatter dying mid-sentence as they caught sight of his face. The scar above his right eye, a souvenir from a pub brawl gone wrong, caught the morning light. Mike had earned that scar the same way he'd earned everything in his life, through violence. He wore it like a badge of honor, another mark of the fear he could inspire. "Take a picture, it'll last longer," he sneered at a teenager who'd been staring too long. The boy quickly looked away, but Mike had already marked him. Later, perhaps. For now, he had other plans. The palace grounds were filling up with more tourists, more potential targets, more opportunities to remind everyone that not all of London played by the rules of polite society. Mike's presence had already created a subtle shift in the crowd's behaviour. Parents pulled their children closer, cameras lowered, and conversations became hushed as he prowled the palace grounds. His reputation preceded him like a storm front. Locals recognised his swagger, the way his eyes scanned for weakness, the predatory set of his shoulders. "Hey, Mike!" a familiar voice called out. 3 figures detached themselves from the shadows of a nearby arch. Danny, Steve and Craig, Mike's usual companions in mayhem. They shared his taste for trouble, though none quite matched his appetite for violence. Danny's knuckles were still scabbed from their last night out, while Steve nursed a yellowing bruise under his left eye. "About time you lot showed up," Mike growled, accepting a half-empty bottle from Craig. The morning air carried the sharp bite of cheap vodka as he took a long pull. "These tourists are starting to irritate me." A rhythmic sound began to cut through the morning air, the measured cadence of marching boots approaching from the palace grounds. The crowd's attention shifted, excited murmurs replacing their earlier unease. The Queen's Guard was beginning their morning patrol. "Oh, look at this!" Mike's voice dripped with contempt as he caught sight of the approaching guards. "The toy soldiers are coming out to play." He passed the bottle back to Craig, his fingers flexing unconsciously. The morning sun caught the brass buttons of the guards' uniforms as they drew nearer, their disciplined march a stark contrast to Mike's predatory prowl. "Mate!" Danny stepped closer, tobacco-stained fingers fidgeting with his jacket zipper. His voice carried an edge of anticipation mixed with genuine concern, the tone of someone who'd seen Mike's violence up close, but never quite like this. "Remember what happened to that bloke who tried to mess with them last month? Ended up in, 'That wasn't me, was it?'" Mike cut him off, with the sharp confidence of someone who'd never met his match. His eyes never left the approaching formation, studying their movement like a predator sizing up prey. The morning light caught their polished buttons and gleaming rifles, but all Mike saw were new targets to add to his collection. Some tourist trying to be funny, getting himself sorted, but me? He spat on the ground, the glob of saliva landing near his scuffed boots. "I know how to handle myself." The guards drew closer, their scarlet tunics blazing against the pale stone backdrop like fresh blood on marble. Each step landed with mechanical precision, boots striking the ground in perfect unison, a rhythm as old as the palace itself. Their bearskin caps added nearly a foot to their already imposing height, casting long shadows in the morning sun. But where others saw ceremony and tradition, Mike saw only an elaborate costume, another authority waiting to be challenged. His jaw tightened as he watched them approach, that familiar itch in his knuckles growing stronger. It was the same sensation he'd felt before every significant fight of his life, before breaking that bouncer's nose at the Red Lion, before putting that construction worker in the hospital. The anticipation of violence hummed through his veins like electricity. "Look at them," he sneered to his companions, voice dripping with the contempt of someone who'd never faced real military discipline. "Marching around like they own the place. Bet they're not so tough without all that fancy dress." Steve and Craig exchanged nervous glances behind his back. They'd seen that particular look in Mike's eyes before, that dangerous gleam that usually ended with police sirens and someone bleeding on the pavement. The crowd had begun to press forward despite their fear, phones raised high, eager to capture whatever was about to unfold. The morning air was thick with tension, carrying whispered warnings from parent to child, tourist to tourist. Mike held his ground like a rock in a stream, deliberately positioning himself in the guard's path. His boots planted firmly on the stones that had witnessed centuries of history, shoulders squared with the arrogance of someone about to make history of his own. His head cocked to that characteristic angle, the same angle that had preceded broken jaws and shattered orbital bones in pubs across London. "Mike?" Danny's voice carried a stronger note of warning now, recognizing something different in this confrontation. The usual drunk tourists and weekend tough guys were one thing. These guards moved with the precision of men who had faced real combat. "Maybe we should—" "Shut it!" Mike snapped, the words cracking like a whip. His eyes remained fixed on the lead guard, studying the man's face for any sign of weakness, any crack in the ceremonial facade. The morning sun cast Mike's shadow long across the courtyard, a dark line intersecting the guard's path like a challenge written in shade. The rhythmic march grew louder, closer, boot heels striking ancient stone, with the inevitability of approaching thunder. "Time to see what these guards are really made of," Mike announced, pitching his voice to carry across the courtyard. Nearby tourists turned in alarm, recognizing the tone of imminent violence. His fingers curled into familiar fists, scarred knuckles whitening with anticipation. The distance between him and the guards continued to shrink, the air growing thick with possibility. Each step of their march brought them closer to answering a question Mike had never considered. What happens when street violence meets military discipline? "Make way for the Queen's Guard!" The command thundered across the courtyard, with the authority of centuries behind it, each word sharp as rifle fire in the morning air. Mike's response was instinctive, born from years of defying every authority he'd ever encountered. He planted his feet wider, combat boots scraping against the ancient stones as a familiar smirk played across his face. The lead guard drew closer, each measured step closing the distance between ceremony and violence. Tourists scattered like leaves in a storm, parents grabbing children, cameras forgotten in the rush to clear a path. But Mike and his companions stood firm, an island of defiance in a sea of retreating bodies. The morning air crackled with tension, thick enough to choke on. "Did you hear that, lads?" Mike called out, his voice carrying the practiced menace that had terrorized London's roughest neighborhoods. Each word dripped with contempt, a street fighter's challenge to military discipline. "We're supposed to make way." He spread his arms wide, leather jacket creaking as he deliberately blocked more of the path, his scarred knuckles gleaming in the morning light. "But I don't see a queen here, do you?" The guards maintained their precise march, boots striking the ground in perfect unison. Each step was a testament to countless hours of drill, every movement honed by tradition and perfected through discipline. Their precision was almost mechanical, their focus absolute. But Mike, blinded by his own bravado, saw only targets approaching, more notches to add to his belt of violence. "Last warning!" The lead guard's voice sliced through the tension again, each syllable carrying the weight of military authority. "Make way!" Mike's response was calculated provocation. He took a single step forward, directly into their path, like a matador challenging a bull. His eyes, hardened by years of street violence, locked onto the lead guard's face, searching hungrily for any sign of hesitation, any crack in the disciplined facade. "Or what?" he challenged, voice thick with the contempt of someone who had never faced real soldiers. "Going to poke me with your pretty rifle?" The crowd had drawn back further now, forming an involuntary arena around the impending confrontation. Parents pulled their children behind them, shielding young eyes from what they sensed was coming. The space between Mike and the approaching guards had become a no-man's land, charged with the electricity of imminent violence. "Look at you lot," Mike continued, his voice rising to ensure everyone heard his challenge. Years of intimidation had taught him how to project menace, how to make each word a weapon. "All dressed up in your fancy uniforms playing soldier." He took another deliberate step forward, the distance now close enough to see the guard's steady breathing, to notice the controlled tension in his jaw, not fear, but something Mike should have recognized as warning. "But underneath all that ceremony, you're just men, aren't you? And I've broken plenty of men." The guards were less than 10 paces away now, their march as unstoppable as time itself. The lead guard's eyes remained fixed forward, but there was something in his bearing that Mike was too arrogant to read. A coiled readiness that spoke of real combat experience, of battles fought in dusty war zones, far from these ceremonial grounds. This wasn't the stance of a ceremonial soldier, it was the controlled poise of a warrior. "£5 says they walk around us," Craig called out from behind, his forced laughter betraying the nervousness even Mike's friends were starting to feel. But Mike wasn't interested in backing down. His body had already shifted into the familiar pre-fight stance, muscle memory from countless street brawls taking over. His weight settled onto his back foot, ready to launch the punch that had ended so many previous confrontations. "Make way!" The final warning carried a different edge now, not just ceremony, but steel. It was the voice of combat veterans, of men who had faced real threats in places where violence wasn't a game. The kind of authority that came from more than just tradition. But Mike was past hearing warnings, past recognizing the difference between his world of street violence and their world of military discipline. The familiar rush of impending conflict coursed through him, drowning out reason, drowning out consequence. "Make me!" he growled, stepping directly into the lead guard's path. Their shadows merged on the courtyard stones, the morning sun casting their silhouettes in stark relief, ceremonial precision, meeting street corner brutality. The guard's brass buttons caught the light, his medals and the immaculate creases of his uniform presenting a perfect target for Mike's challenge to authority. The air grew thicker with each passing second, the crowd's nervous energy adding to the tension. Mike's fingers flexed unconsciously, old scars stretching across his knuckles, white with anticipation. Each breath seemed to take longer, the world narrowing to this moment, this challenge. The guards' march continued, their red uniforms like a tide of living flame bearing down on his defiance. "Last chance," Mike announced, his voice carrying that dangerous edge his victims had learned to fear, though it seemed laughably hollow against the backdrop of real military bearing. "Turn around and march back to your palace." But the guards showed no sign of deviation, no indication that his threat carried any weight in their world of discipline and duty. They moved like an unstoppable force, each step bringing them closer to the immovable object of Mike's arrogance. The distance had closed to arm's length. The morning air hung heavy with anticipation, the crowd holding its collective breath. Something was about to break. Either the guards' discipline or Mike's defiance. It happened in a flash. Mike's fist shot out, with the speed born of countless street fights, a movement that had broken jaws and shattered noses across London's roughest neighbourhoods. His knuckles, scarred from years of violence, connected squarely with the lead guard's jaw. The sound of impact cracked across the courtyard like a gunshot, echoing off the ancient palace walls. But what happened next defied Mike's every expectation, shattering his understanding of violence as completely as he'd hoped to shatter the guard's composure. The guard didn't flinch, didn't stagger, didn't even blink. His face remained as immobile as the palace itself, as if Mike's best punch had been nothing more than a gentle breeze against granite. Instead, Mike felt like he'd punched a brick wall wrapped in steel. The guard's jaw had tightened on impact, muscles hardened by years of military service and combat training absorbing the blow with terrifying efficiency. Pain shot through Mike's knuckles, radiating up his arm in waves of shocking agony. The familiar sensation of flesh yielding to his fist was replaced by the sickening realization that he'd just struck something immovable, unbreakable. "Bloody hell!" he hissed, cradling his throbbing hand. His fingers, which had delivered so much pain to others, now screamed in protest at their meeting with real military discipline. The guard's eyes finally shifted to meet his, and Mike found himself staring into the calm, focused gaze of a man who had faced far worse than street thugs. Those eyes held something Mike had never seen in his victims. Not fear, not anger, but the cold calculation of someone who had dealt with real violence in war zones, far from these ceremonial grounds. "You hit like a woman." The guard's voice was cold, precise. The voice of someone who had dealt with real violence, not just pub brawls and street corner scraps. Each word fell like ice into the morning air, cutting through Mike's pain and penetrating his tough guy facade. The casual dismissal of his best punch, delivered with military precision, ignited his rage anew. "Who the fuck do you think you—" Mike's sentence died in his throat, transformed into a gargled cry of shock as the guard's fist connected with his jaw. The strike was devastatingly precise, carrying the full weight of military training and combat experience. It wasn't the wild haymaker of a street brawler, but the calculated strike of a trained soldier. Mike felt something pop, a sickening crunch, as his jaw dislocated under the impact. The sound was like a branch breaking, but the branch was his own bone. "That's how you throw a punch," the guard stated matter-of-factly, his voice carrying the same ceremonial precision as his earlier commands. There was no emotion in his tone, no satisfaction, no anger. Just the calm statement of a professional who had completed another task with military efficiency. Mike staggered backward, his mouth working soundlessly, unable to form words through the blinding pain. Blood trickled from the corner of his lips, mixing with the saliva he could no longer contain. The metallic taste filled his mouth as his tongue probed uselessly at teeth that no longer aligned properly. The world seemed to tilt and spin around him, reality distorted by waves of agony radiating from his shattered jaw. The crowd gasped collectively, a sound that mixed horror and satisfaction in equal measure. Parents who had shielded their children's eyes now let them look, sensing a lesson worth learning. Danny, Steve, and Craig took involuntary steps backward, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of real military efficiency. This wasn't the wild brawling they were used to. This was something else entirely, something that belonged more to the battlefield than the street corner. Mike's legs buckled, sending him sprawling onto the courtyard stones. His hands clutched at his face, fingers probing the grotesque new angle of his jaw, feeling the unnatural movement of bone beneath skin. Each touch sent fresh waves of pain through his skull. Attempting to speak produced only garbled sounds, his usual threats reduced to unintelligible mumbling. Blood continued to drip between his fingers, each drop marking the stones beneath him, staining the ancient courtyard with evidence of his humiliation. The guard hadn't moved from his position, hadn't even broken stance. His fist had already returned to its proper place at his side, the only evidence of the altercation being a slight redness on his knuckles that would soon fade. His eyes had returned to their forward focus, as if dealing with violent thugs was simply another part of his ceremonial duties. Not a single button on his uniform was out of place. Not a single crease disturbed by the violence he'd just delivered. Through the haze of pain, Mike tried to push himself up, his legs shaking with the effort, but his body, accustomed to being the dealer of pain rather than its recipient, refused to cooperate. Each attempt to rise sent fresh waves of agony through his dislocated jaw. He managed only to rise to his knees, blood and saliva forming a dark pool beneath him on the courtyard stones, marking his defeat in a growing stain that would soon be washed away and forgotten. The morning sun highlighted the contrast between them. Mike kneeling in an expanding puddle of his own blood, the guard standing tall and unmoved, his uniform still pristine, his bearing unaltered by the violence he had just delivered with such surgical precision. The rhythmic sound of boots on stone announced the arrival of additional guards, their scarlet uniforms forming a ring of authority around the scene. They moved with the coordinated precision of men who had trained together in far more dangerous situations than this, each taking position with tactical efficiency. Guard Captain James Harrison's approach was heralded by the sharp click of his boots on the courtyard stones. His presence carried the weight of 25 years of military service, including tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. The brass on his uniform caught the morning light as he surveyed the scene. Mike still on his knees, blood dripping from his dislocated jaw, the lead guard standing at perfect attention. "Report," Harrison commanded, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had commanded men in real combat. "Subject attempted assault, sir," the lead guard responded, his bearing perfect despite the attempted attack. Corrective action was taken. The clinical description of what had just occurred somehow made it more impressive. This hadn't been retaliation, but simply duty being executed with military precision. Mike made another attempt to rise, producing only a gargled sound of rage through his misaligned jaw. Two guards stepped forward immediately, their movements synchronized and efficient. They secured his arms with practiced ease, their grip professional rather than punitive. This wasn't personal for them, just another threat being contained, another duty being performed. "Get off me!" Mike tried to snarl, but the words came out as unintelligible mumbling. His attempts to struggle were met with the immovable discipline of military training. These weren't bouncers or street fighters. These were soldiers who had handled far more dangerous individuals in war zones. Captain Harrison stepped closer, examining Mike with the detached interest of someone assessing a minor tactical situation. "You seem to have made a serious error in judgment," he observed, his tone carrying neither anger nor satisfaction. "These men aren't ceremonial figures for your entertainment. They're active duty soldiers who've served in combat zones you couldn't find on a map." Mike's friends had backed away to the edge of the crowd, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. They watched as additional palace security arrived, their movements coordinated with the guards in a well-practiced dance of authority. This wasn't the chaos of a street brawl. This was military precision in action. "The uniform you chose to disrespect," Harrison continued, adjusting his white gloves with methodical care, "has been earned through more hardship than you'll ever know. That soldier you tried to assault, he's completed 3 tours in active combat zones. The punch you received wasn't revenge. It was simply the measured response of a professional dealing with a threat." Blood continued to drip from Mike's jaw, his attempts at defiance reduced to painful grunts. The guards holding him maintained their perfect posture, their grip neither loosening nor tightening despite his weak struggles. They stood like statues, but living statues, forged in the fires of real combat, tempered by actual service. "You're not the first to mistake ceremony for weakness," Harrison noted, his voice carrying to the silent crowd, "though you may be the first to make that mistake quite so painfully." He turned to the lead guard, who still hadn't moved from his position. "Carry on with your patrol. Well executed." The lead guard's response was a single, precise nod before resuming his march. There was no triumph in his bearing, no satisfaction at having demolished Mike's bravado. He moved with the same disciplined precision as before, duty uninterrupted by the violence he'd been forced to deliver. Police sirens pierced the morning air as 2 patrol cars pulled up to the palace gates. The officers who emerged moved with practiced efficiency. They'd dealt with Mike Conway before, though never quite like this. His usual swagger was notably absent as they approached, replaced by pained whimpers and involuntary drooling from his dislocated jaw. "Same troublemaker, different outcome," the lead officer observed, taking in Mike's condition with professional detachment. "Though I must say this is an improvement over your usual state." He turned to Captain Harrison, notebook ready. "I assume he'll be pressing charges against—" "That won't be necessary," Harrison interrupted smoothly. "Her Majesty's Guard were simply performing their duty in response to a direct assault. Everything was handled according to protocol." His emphasis on protocol carried the weight of centuries of military authority. Mike made another attempt at speech, producing only a wet gurgle. Blood had soaked into his shirt, staining the fabric a dark crimson. The morning sun highlighted the stark contrast between his dishevelled state and the immaculate uniforms of the guards who still held him. "We've got plenty of witnesses," a younger officer noted, gesturing to the crowd, multiple accounts of him initiating the confrontation, throwing the first punch. He paused, consulting his notes. "And given his prior convictions—" Mike's eyes darted around wildly, looking for support, but found none. His friends had disappeared into the crowd, loyalty evaporating in the face of real consequences. The tourists who'd witnessed his humiliation were already sharing knowing looks. This was what happened when you mistook military discipline for weakness. "He'll need medical attention before processing," the lead officer stated, examining Mike's jaw with clinical interest. "Though I suspect this might be the first time Mr. Conway's inability to speak works in everyone's favour." A few nearby witnesses nodded in agreement, remembering Mike's usual stream of threats and profanity. The guards transferred Mike to police custody with military precision, their movements synchronized and efficient. He offered no resistance now. The fight had quite literally been knocked out of him. As handcuffs clicked into place, his shoulders slumped in defeat, though his eyes still burned with impotent rage. Through it all, the palace routine continued uninterrupted. The changing of the guard proceeded with its usual precision. Tourists snapped their photos, and the morning sun continued its climb over Buckingham Palace. The only evidence of the incident was a small, dark stain on the courtyard stones where Mike's blood had fallen. And even that would soon be washed away, leaving no trace of his failed challenge to centuries of military discipline. So what do you think about this encounter between a common street thug and the Queen's Guard? It serves as a powerful reminder that beneath their ceremonial duties lies the hard-earned discipline of professional soldiers. What would you have done if you witnessed such a display of misguided aggression meeting military efficiency? Do you think Mike Conway learned anything from his painful encounter with real military discipline, or will his jaw heal faster than his wounded pride? If this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more compelling stories about the Royal Guards. Make sure to press that bell icon to never miss our latest uploads. Check out our other videos appearing on your screen right now, including similar encounters where those who underestimated the Queen's Guard learned valuable lessons about respect and tradition. Remember, sometimes the most powerful lessons are taught not through words but through actions. And some lessons, like Mike's, come with a dislocated jaw. Until next time, keep watching, keep learning, and most importantly, keep respecting those who stand guard over tradition, with more than just ceremony behind their stance.